The kitchen of the Marquez estate was always alive with fire, sweat, and the clatter of iron pots. Long before the sun rose, the slaves and servants were already bent over their tasks, their bodies moving in rhythm with the demands of masters, who never set foot in the place where their food was born. Smoke curled upward from the hearth, mingling with the smell of onions, roasting fowl, and the sourness of wine spilled on stone. It was a kingdom of labor and silence, ruled not by the noble family upstairs, but by the overseer who carried a switch and eyes that saw everything. Among the bent backs and weary hands worked a girl named Isadora. Her wrists bore the faint scars of chains long removed, but her spirit had never been freed. She had been sold to the Marquez family when she was only 11 years old, bought like livestock at the docks and carried into the mansion not as a child, but as property. Now, at 19, she knew the kitchen as others might know a mother's embrace. Every corner, every hidden knife, every crack in the stone floor was familiar to her, and though her body moved with practiced obedience, her mind was a quiet storm. The Marquez family never spared her a glance beyond orders. To them, she was nothing more than a pair of hands, but she remembered every cruelty. She remembered when Don Alvaro Marquez had ordered the flogging of her brother until his back was a ruin, simply because the boy had dared to taste a grape meant for the table. She remembered the sneering laughter of Doña Carmela, the matriarch, who once poured hot broth over Isadora's hands to teach her caution. And worst of all, she remembered the night when young Master Emilio, heir to the estate, dragged her into the granary and left her with bruises hidden beneath her rags. The house above glowed with wealth and laughter. The kitchen below festered with resentment and hunger. And yet, the Marquez family was preparing to celebrate a wedding. Emilio was to marry the daughter of a wealthy merchant, binding the two houses with gold and power. Every servant in the USOD estate knew that the feast had to be perfect, for failure on such a day meant punishment not just for one, but for all. For weeks, the kitchen labored without rest. Meat was salted, barrels of wine rolled into cellars, spices measured with precision. The air grew thick with anticipation and fear, and through it all, Isadora worked silently, her hands kneading dough, chopping herbs, stirring pots. But behind her lowered eyes, she was counting the bottles of oil, counting the vials of powders smuggled in from apothecaries, counting the moments that would lead her not to another day of servitude, but to a night of reckoning. She had learned patience the hard way. For years she had swallowed her rage like bitter medicine, waiting for a chance, and now the chance had come, delivered to her in the form of a wedding banquet. For once, the entire Marquez family would sit together at the same table, their mouths open, their throats welcoming whatever she placed before them. For once they would eat not just with hunger but with trust. The other servants whispered with excitement about the bride, said to be beautiful as a summer morning and gentle in manner. Some pitied her for being tied to Emilio, who even his own father called reckless. Others dreamed that perhaps the young mistress might be kind to the household, unlike Doña Carmela. But Isadora felt no pity, no curiosity. To her, the bride was only another guest at a table that would soon become a grave. Late at night, when the kitchen fires had burned low, Isadora sat alone by the ashes and remembered her mother's voice. Not her real mother, but the older slave, woman who had once comforted her in the first years of her captivity. "Revenge," the woman had whispered once, "is like a dish that must be cooked slowly. Too fast, and it will burn your tongue. Too slow, and it will spoil. But if you wait long enough, if you prepare it with care, it will taste sweeter than honey." Those words had lodged in Isadora's soul like scripture, and as the wedding day drew closer, she felt her heart beating not with fear, but with a grim anticipation. One morning she stood at the well, drawing buckets of water while dawn painted the sky. The birds sang in the olive trees, the first light touched the tiled roof of the estate, and somewhere inside, she heard laughter as the family prepared for their celebration. Isadora looked at her reflection in the bucket, her eyes dark, her hair tied back in a rag, her face plain and tired. But behind that face, she knew, there lived someone else, someone waiting, patient as poison, The kitchen was her battlefield, the pots, her weapons, the spices, her disguise, and the feast that was meant to mark a marriage. She would turn it into a funeral. The morning of the wedding broke with the kind of brightness that seemed to mock suffering. The estate, normally a fortress of stone and shadow, had been dressed in ribbons and flowers. Carriages arrived from neighboring towns, their wheels rattling across the cobblestones, their passengers glittering in silks and jewels. Musicians tuned their instruments in the courtyard, their laughter drifting upward with the scent of roses. The Marquez household, swollen with guests, was alive with the chaos of celebration. Down in the kitchen, however, there was no celebration, only frenzy. The ovens roared, the great spit turned with boar and lamb, and pots big enough to bathe in boiled over with stews. Servants moved like ants in the heat, hauling, chopping, grinding, all under the harsh commands of the overseer. Every mistake was punished with curses, sometimes blows, for the family would not tolerate imperfection on this day. Isadora moved among them with silent focus. Her hands were steady, her mind sharper than the knives she wielded. To the overseer, she looked no different than usual, just another weary slave keeping pace with impossible demands. But within her apron pocket, hidden in a folded cloth, lay a small vial filled with powder the color of ash. It had taken her months to acquire it. A sympathetic apothecary, himself once a slave, had passed it into her hand, with eyes that understood. Too much and asked too little. One pinch was enough to make a man's stomach twist with agony. Two would still him forever. She carried enough to silence a hall. Emilio Marquez, the bridegroom, had been awake all night with drink. When he stumbled into the kitchen in the morning, demanding a taste of the feast to impress his companions, Isadora caught her first clear look at him in weeks. His fine suit was wrinkled, his dark hair uncombed, his eyes bloodshot. Yet arrogance radiated from him as though he wore a crown. He swaggered past the servants, laughing, clapping shoulders, mocking the trembling girl who spilled wine as he approached. "Isadora," he said suddenly, catching her name from some corner of memory. "Still here, little kitchen mouse? How long has it been since I—" His words broke into cruel laughter, unfinished but heavy with meaning. His friends joined in, unaware or uncaring of what lay between them. Isadora bowed her head, murmuring only, "Si, senor," though her hands tightened so hard around the ladle they almost shook. "Bring me a taste of the stew," Emilio ordered, dropping into a chair as though he were already king of the world. She obeyed. Carefully, steadily, she lifted a spoonful of steaming broth and poured it into a silver dish. Not yet. Not now. Not with his friends watching. She set it before him, plain and untainted, and stood silent as he slurped noisily and waved her away with dismissal, as though she were a dog. Her chance would come later, when the hall was full, when every mouth at the table was open, every goblet lifted. Revenge had to be taken not in shadows, but in light. Upstairs, the ceremony began. Bells rang from the village chapel, carried on the wind. Isadora could not see the bride, but she heard the chatter of maids who rushed through the kitchen with flowers, describing her gown of ivory lace, her hair braided with pearls. They gushed over her beauty, over the tears of joy in her eyes as she pledged herself to Emilio. Isadora listened, unmoved. To her, this marriage was only another chain linking power to power, another nail driven into the coffin of her kind. Hours passed. The ceremony ended, the guests returned, and the hall filled with music and laughter. Long tables groaned beneath the weight of dishes carried up from below. Roasted birds with crisp skin, glazed hams, baskets of bread, bowls of olives, and figs and decanters of wine that caught the light like rubies. Servants poured and poured, their faces blank masks of submission. Isadora's hands were everywhere, unseen yet indispensable. She garnished platters, stirred sauces, arranged goblets. Each movement was precise, deliberate. At her hip, the vial weighed heavily, its presence burning against her skin. She waited, patient as a predator, The feast had only begun. Her moment was coming. Emilio stood at the head of the table, his arm wrapped loosely around his new bride, who blushed with the sweetness of youth. He toasted loudly, boasting of the Marquez name, of the union of two houses, of the wealth that would pour into their coffers. Laughter and applause shook the hall. His bride smiled, though her eyes darted nervously to the goblet in his hand, perhaps already sensing the cruelty beneath his charm. When he raised his cup, the guests followed. The hall shimmered with lifted goblets, crystal and silver catching the light. The overseer barked for the kitchen to bring more wine. The servants hurried, their hands trembling. And among them walked Isidora, carrying a tray heavy with goblets. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a steady rhythm like drums of war. Each step brought her closer. Each breath filled her lungs with smoke, spice, and inevitability. She passed the tables, her eyes lowered, her hands steady. The vial rested in her pocket, waiting. Soon, very soon, the bridegroom's feast had begun. The hall above roared with music and laughter, but below, in the sweltering belly of the kitchen, Isidora's thoughts wandered to places colder, darker, and older than the feast unfolding overhead. The crackle of firewood and the hiss of fat, dripping into flames, could not drown the memories that returned to her in waves. The present, with all its chaos, blurred at the edges, and what rose clear before her eyes were the ashes of the past. She had been only 8 when soldiers came to her village. Their boots churned the earth, their banners black against the sun. They carried torches and blades, and by nightfall, the air was full of screams and smoke. She remembered her mother's hands, rough from weaving, pressing her into the hollow of a tree, whispering for her to stay silent. She remembered the smell of burning roofs, the taste of dirt in her mouth as she bit her arm to keep from crying out. And she remembered most vividly the sound of laughter, men laughing as they dragged people into the square, laughter as if cruelty were a game. When dawn came, her village was nothing but cinders. The soldiers took the children who had survived, binding their wrists, driving them like cattle to the coast. There, under the stink of fish and tar, she was sold. Coins clinked. Her name, her family, her world, all erased in a single bargain. The Marquez family had been her purchasers. She still remembered the first time she saw the estate, white stone walls gleaming in the sun, iron gates that closed behind her with a sound that would haunt her forever. Don Alvaro Marquez, stern and broad-shouldered, inspected her as if she were a piece of livestock. Doña Carmela, his wife, sneered at the dirt on her face and ordered her scrubbed before she was allowed in the kitchen. The cruelty began at once, subtle and sharp, until it became the air she breathed. Her brother Diego had come with her, younger by 2 years, his eyes wide with fear. They were inseparable at first, clinging to each other in the strange, merciless house. But Diego was spirited, too spirited for servitude. He questioned. He resisted. One day he snatched a grape from a passing tray, a small act of hunger. For this, Don Alvaro ordered him whipped in front of the household. Isidora remembered his cries, the whip cracking again and again, the flesh splitting, the blood staining the stones. She remembered Doña Carmela's cold smile as though it were a lesson worth teaching. Diego did not last the winter. Fever took him, or perhaps it was despair. Isidora had buried her grief in silence. She learned obedience outwardly, but inside she was memorizing every face, every slight, every wound. Emilio, the heir, was worst of all. Spoiled, vicious, drunk, on power even as a boy, he grew into cruelty the way others grew into manhood. When he cornered her in the granary, when his laughter filled the air as he pushed her down, something in her broke. Not her will, but her belief in a world where justice might exist without her hand to bring it. Now, years later, those ashes smoldered still. Each dish she prepared for the wedding was more than food. It was a memory sharpened into a blade. Every slice of meat, every garnish placed was marked by her intent. The hall was filled with lords and ladies, but to Isidora they were only masks covering the same faces she had known since childhood, cruel, proud, laughing at the pain of others. She slipped into the wine cellar when no one watched. The walls, they were cool, damp with age, lined with bottles older than her captivity. She lit a single candle, its flame trembling in the darkness, and drew the vial from her pocket. For a moment she stared at it, her reflection glinting faintly in the glass. Her hand did not shake. She uncorked a bottle of red, poured a measure into a jug, and sprinkled in a pinch of the powder. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. The jug would be brought to the head table, reserved for the bride, the groom, and their closest kin. She replaced the cork, smoothed her apron, and carried the jug back to the kitchen with the calmness of someone carrying water. Above, Emilio was shouting for more wine, his voice echoing like a whip. The musicians struck up a livelier tune. The guests clapped and sang. The bride's laughter rang out, sweet but uncertain, like a bell that trembles in the wind. Isadora stepped into the hall with the jug in her arms, her eyes lowered, her pace measured. She moved past the guests, past the noblemen boasting, past the ladies fanning themselves with silken plumes. No one looked twice at her. To them she was invisible, just another shadow in service. And yet, in her invisibility lay her power. She neared the head table. She thought of Diego, of her mother's rough hands, of her village swallowed by fire. She thought of every lash, every slap, every night of humiliation. And then she thought of the words the old woman had whispered long ago. Revenge must be cooked slowly. Tonight the dish was ready. The hall was glowing with candlelight, golden flames reflected in polished goblets and glittering jewels, long tables bent under the weight of food, each platter a monument to wealth and indulgence, roast birds glazed with honey, loaves of bread, still steaming bowls of olives, pyramids of sugared fruit, all of it gleamed like offerings to some ancient god. Yet amid all the splendor, Isadora saw only mouths waiting to open, throats waiting to swallow, and hearts waiting to falter. She carried the jug of wine as though it were nothing, yet to her it was heavier than stone. It was the vessel of her life's purpose, the culmination of years of silence and suffering. Each step toward the head table was measured, her eyes fixed on the floor, her heart beating not wildly but steadily, like the throb of a drum that had been waiting for this rhythm all its life. When she reached the dais, Emilio barely looked at her. He was too busy boasting, his arm draped lazily around his young bride as he laughed at some crude joke. The girl smiled faintly, her eyes darting nervously to the floor as if she already sensed her gilded cage closing around her. Don Alvaro, the patriarch, sat straight-backed, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk guarding its perch. Doña Carmela, jeweled and powdered, sipped her wine as though the world were her mirror. Isadora bowed her head, poured the poisoned wine into the goblets at the head table, and stepped back silently. No one noticed her, no one thought of her, just as she intended. Back in the kitchen, the overseer barked for more platters. Isadora obeyed with precision, but each time she lifted a dish, her mind ran ahead to the hall where her vengeance waited. She sprinkled a second measure of powder into the sauce for the lamb, ensuring it would reach not only the Marquez family, but their most honored guests. For the servants, the lower tables, the food remained clean. Her war was not with them. The poison was subtle, without taste or scent. It would not strike immediately. It would creep through their veins like a shadow, coiling tighter with each heartbeat. At first, they might feel only warmth, a flush, a dizziness mistaken for wine, then nausea, then pain, and finally, silence. As the feast raged on, the bride was coaxed into dancing. Emilio stumbled after her, drunk on both wine and arrogance, spinning her clumsily to the laughter of his companions. The hall clapped in rhythm, stomping boots and slapping tables, the air thick with sweat and song. Above it all, Isadora moved like a ghost, refilling goblets, clearing plates, always unseen, always waiting. And yet, as she worked, her mind betrayed her with whispers of doubt. Not fear of being caught. No, she had long prepared herself for that, but fear of mercy. Would death be enough to balance the scales? Would one night of blood erase years of humiliation and grief? Or was she too becoming the same as those who had ruined her life, another soul who laughed as others suffered? She looked toward the bride, whose laughter was hollow, whose eyes flickered with unease. The girl had no hand in Diego's death, no part in the lash or the burn. Yet tonight she would drink from the poisoned goblet all the same. A flicker of hesitation trembled through Isadora's chest, but it passed quickly. Collateral, she told herself. The innocent were always trampled under the boots of the powerful. Had not her own village burned for nothing? Did not Diego die for a grape? Justice was not clean, justice was never clean. As the night deepened, the signs began to show. A nobleman, at the far end of the head table, dabbed his brow with a cloth, muttering about the heat. Doña Carmela shifted uncomfortably, her hand pressing to her stomach. Emilio, too drunk to notice, poured himself another glass and gulped it greedily. The bride's hand trembled as she set down her fork, her smile frozen on her lips. Isadora felt her pulse quicken. The recipe had been measured, the dish prepared, the table set. Now the banquet of revenge was being eaten before her eyes, and yet no cry had gone up. No collapse, no scream. Not yet. The poison was working its way slowly, cruelly, invisibly. The laughter continued, though it now had an edge, as if forced. The music swelled, but some dancers faltered. Emilio bellowed for more wine, his voice raw, his face flushed, sweat running down his temples. In the kitchen, Isadora stood still for the first time that day. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of the table and closed her eyes. Her mind replayed every lash that had torn Diego's back, every sneer on Carmela's lips, every night of hunger, every touch of Emilio's hand. She whispered to herself words no one could hear. It is done. Above, the feast was turning. At first, no one wanted to believe it. A cough here, a gasp there, small things dismissed as drunkenness, as overeating, as the heat of so many bodies pressed together in the hall. But the unease spread, subtle as smoke. A lady fanned herself furiously, her face pale beneath rouge. A merchant dabbed at his lips, whispering that the wine tasted bitter. Emilio, his laughter booming above the crowd, staggered mid-step and dropped his goblet. It clattered to the floor, spilling a dark red pool that spread like blood across the stones. The musicians faltered. The dancers slowed. The hall filled not with song but with murmurs, sharp and anxious, rippling down the long tables. Then came the first collapse. Don Alvaro's cousin, seated near the dais, slumped forward into his plate, his fingers twitching, his mouth foaming faintly at the corners. A scream tore through the air, high and shrill, and the spell of festivity broke. Chaos erupted. Chairs scraped back, dishes toppled. Servants rushed to and fro without direction. Some guests clutched their stomachs, their faces twisting in agony. Others tried to rise, only to stumble, their legs failing beneath them. The sweet smell of roasted meat mixed with the acrid scent of vomit. The hall, once radiant with light, seemed to darken as fear swallowed the laughter whole. At the head table, Doña Carmela was doubled over, her jeweled hands clawing at her throat. Don Alvaro slammed his fist on the table, roaring for order, for help, for someone to bring a physician. But his voice cracked with pain even as he shouted. His face turned gray, his eyes bulging with the effort of standing. Beside him, the young bride whimpered, clutching her side, her body trembling as she tried to rise. Emilio reached for her, but his own arm shook violently. He stumbled, his proud head lolling, his lips moving with curses that no one could understand. Isadora moved through the chaos unnoticed. She carried no tray, no goblet now, only the silence of purpose. Around her, guests shrieked, servants wailed. Children cried. The overseer shouted commands, but his voice broke into coughs that racked his chest until blood spotted his lips. He fell to his knees, his whip clattering uselessly beside him. No one looked at her. No one ever did. That was the cruel joke of her existence. She had been invisible all her life, and now, in the moment of their destruction, she remained unseen. It was as though death itself had donned her apron and walked quietly among them. Some tried to flee. A nobleman pushed back his chair, stumbling toward the door, only to collapse before reaching it. A lady clawed at a servant, demanding water, but vomited across her gown before she could finish the plea. The musicians abandoned their instruments, their strings still humming faintly in the silence, and bolted for the courtyard, their terrified cries echoing down the halls. Emilio fell at last, his laughter gone, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish gasping on dry land. He clawed at the table, dragging plates and cups down with him, before crashing to the floor at his bride's feet. She stared down at him with wide, glassy eyes, her lips trembling, her hands shaking violently. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but only blood came, staining her white gown crimson. Isidora watched her, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, something like pity stirred in her chest. The bride had been a lamb brought to slaughter, bound not by her will but by her father's greed and Emilio's arrogance. But pity was useless now. The poison did not care for innocence, nor did vengeance. Don Alvaro roared one last time, his eyes blazing with fury as they found Isidora across the hall. For a heartbeat, she thought he knew. His mouth opened as if to curse her name, but then his voice broke into a guttural choke, and he toppled face first onto the table, rattling goblets as his blood mingled with spilled wine. Silence fell slowly, horribly. The cries dwindled into groans, the groans into stillness. One by one, the great and the proud crumpled into their chairs, onto the floor, across the banquet they had demanded be perfect. The hall of celebration had become a tomb, lit by candles, that flickered as if uneasy at what they revealed. Isidora stood alone amid the ruin, her chest rising and falling, her hands steady. Around her lay the Marquez family, their kin, their allies. Faces that had once looked down on her, now pressed into the dirt like anyone else. Gold rings slipped from cold fingers. Jeweled combs fell from hair to the floor. Power, wealth, arrogance, scattered and broken, no different than the bones of peasants left in shallow graves. The wedding had indeed become a funeral, and Isidora, the kitchen slave, was the only mourner. The hall stank of wine, bile, and death. Candles guttered in their sconces, their wax dripping like tears onto the tables. The silence was unnatural, broken only by the faint crackle of fire in the great hearth and the distant bark of dogs outside, unaware of the carnage within. The once grand banquet had collapsed into a graveyard of overturned goblets and still bodies, jeweled finery marred with stains of vomit and blood. Isidora stood motionless in the center of it all, her breath shallow, her hands at her sides. For years she had imagined this moment, rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times. She had thought it would taste like triumph, like freedom. Yet now, standing among the fallen, she felt only a heavy stillness pressing into her chest. Her eyes fell on Emilio first. He lay sprawled beside his chair, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of fury and confusion. His jeweled hand was still outstretched, as if reaching for a goblet that would never come. The bride was beside him, collapsed in her lace gown, her hair undone, pearls scattered like spilled tears across the floor. The sight pricked at something inside Isidora, but she pushed it down. The young girl had been a lamb to slaughter, true, but lambs were eaten alongside wolves in the same feast. Dawn. Alvaro, once the proud hawk of the family, was slumped across the table, his heavy frame crushing plates beneath him. Doña Carmela's body was twisted on the floor, her jeweled necklace half torn from her neck as though she had tried to rip it free in her final agony. The overseer lay in the corner, his whip inches from his stiffened fingers. For a long time, Isidora simply looked at them. She wanted to sear their still faces into her memory, to remind herself that this was real, that her suffering had not been in vain. Yet with each corpse she studied, her chest grew heavier. Victory was a strange companion. It did not smile, it did not cheer. It simply stood with her in the silence, staring at what had been done. The doors burst open suddenly. Servants, who had been banished from the hall during the feast, crept in at last, their whispers trembling as they beheld the ruin. A maid dropped her tray with a crash, her eyes wide with horror. A boy no older than 10 began to sob, his cries echoing against the high ceiling. They looked at Isadora, standing untouched in the center, and though none spoke the words aloud, their eyes asked the question, how? She did not answer. She did not need to. Some of them looked at her with fear, others with awe, still others with something like gratitude, for they too had suffered the whips, the hunger, the cruelty, and though none had dared dream of such, a reckoning all of them knew, deep down, that it had been long deserved. The youngest maid, her voice trembling, whispered, "The Marquez are gone." The words spread among them like wildfire. Gone. All of them. Dead. The servant's fear began to shift, transforming into something else. Uncertainty, yes, but also a strange, fragile hope. Without the Marquez family, the estate was nothing but walls and land. Chains had lost their masters, but freedom was not so simple. Isadora knew what would come. The village would hear the news. The church would demand answers. Officials would descend on the estate, sniffing, for the cause of such a calamity. Rumors would spread. Poison, witchcraft, God's punishment. Someone would be blamed. And though she had been invisible all her life, she would not remain invisible now. The servants began to scatter, some rushing to the stables, others to the fields, carrying whispers with them into the night. Soon the world beyond the gates would know that the wedding had become a funeral. Soon the world would come looking for a culprit. Isadora bent down, slowly beside Emilio's body. She looked into his lifeless face, remembered the cruel laughter that had once filled this same hall, remembered Diego's screams in the courtyard, remembered the hot broth scalding her hands. For a moment, she thought she might spit upon him, or strike his corpse as he had once struck her. But she did nothing. Death had already done what she could not. She stood, straightened her apron, and turned to the others. The servants watched her, waiting, as though she were suddenly something more than what she had been a few hours ago. No longer a shadow, no longer invisible, but the only one among them who had acted, who had changed the shape of their world with her own 2 hands. Her voice was low, but it carried through the silence. "Leave them," she said. "Let the crows have their feast." Some gasped, others nodded. One by one, they began to obey, stepping back from the dead, their faces pale but their eyes lit with the flicker of something they had not known before. The possibility of freedom. Isadora turned her gaze to the high windows. Dawn was still far off, but the night felt lighter, as though the sky itself had shifted. She did not know what the morning would bring, chains, fire, punishment, or escape. But she knew one thing with certainty. The Marquez family, who had chained her life in our misery, would never wake to see it. The wedding feast had ended in silence, and from that silence, a new story was about to begin.